Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our January 19th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. Today, we'll preview Farm Bureau members' priorities for the state legislative session and analyze where things stand with today's crop and livestock markets. Let's start with a discussion about property taxes, underground hydrogen exploration, and other public policy issues Farm Bureau will be addressing during Iowa's 2026 legislative session. For that, here's Spokesman Editor Tom Block with Iowa Farm Bureau State Policy Advisor Kevin Keel.
We're visiting with Iowa Farm Bureau State Policy Advisor Kevin Keel. Kevin, what are some of the key issues affecting agriculture during the 2026 Iowa legislative session?
Farm Bureau every year walks into legislative session not knowing exactly what will take place during the session. We won't know that for sure until bills start getting introduced and legislators start laying out their priorities. But we do know there's going to be a few things that they're going to have to tackle this year. Every year, they're going to set their budget and pass the various appropriation bills to fund the state government. Additionally, we know that property tax reform is going to be a top priority for the legislature. Farm Bureau is going to be working on some issues proactively as well. We've got a few tax reform issues that we'd like to see get across the finish line. And then additionally, Farm Bureau members set new policy regarding underground natural resources and the potential for the development of underground hydrogen. And so those are all going to be issues that we try to tackle this upcoming legislative session.
Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into each one of these topics, Kevin. And let's start with a look at the state's budget. What does the budget situation look like right now in the state of Iowa?
The budget situation is oftentimes going to set the tone and the tenor for the upcoming legislative session. It'll dictate what the legislature can and cannot accomplish. Over the past several years, we've been in a situation where the legislature was collecting more income tax revenue and state revenue than their expenditures. So they were building up reserves, and now we're in a situation because of tax cuts where revenue is coming down on an annual basis, and they're using reserve funds to fund the budget for the upcoming year and all the appropriations bills. So we're in a situation right now where the legislature is going to have to make tough decisions, but that's true of any legislative session. The legislature is going to have to make tough decisions because there are dozens and dozens of bills introduced, and they would create new programs that would need to be funded. And so every year the legislature has to decide what are the priorities of the state and what are the things that they're going to fund. So Farm Bureau in this upcoming budgeting season, we're going to be making sure that line items important to agriculture are funded, whether it be for veterinary services, butchery innovation, dairy innovation, conservation, foreign animal disease protection, renewable fuels. So we'll be monitoring all of those budget line items. But the main goal, the top priority of Farm Bureau in any budgeting year is to ensure that the legislature is funding their obligations and not pushing those funding obligations onto the backs of property tax payers and making the property tax problem even worse in Iowa.
Tell me a little bit more about that, Kevin. How do the budgeting decisions by the legislature impact property taxpayers?
You know, when we think about the state budget is sales and income tax. Your local governments are the ones that are collecting property tax, your county, your community college, your school district. In fact, school districts make up the largest collection of property taxes statewide. So while all of these local governments ultimately collect the property taxes, the state legislature dictates what those local governments can and cannot do. They set what they can and cannot spend money on. And so the legislature does have a fair amount of control over the property tax situation in Iowa. And that's true also of the state budget. So when the legislature sets their budget, they, on an annual basis, will make a decision of whether or not to fund property tax credits. These property tax credits provide dollar-for-dollar property tax relief across the state of Iowa. The ones that we look at the most closely are the homestead property tax credit, which goes against your primary residence and brings down your property tax bill on your home. And then additionally, the ag land and family farm tax credit, which is a property tax credit that reduces your property tax bill on ag land. The state also funds a variety of other line items that bring down property taxes, including property tax replacement payments when they set K through 12 funding on an annual basis. This ensures that the state is picking up more of the tab of K through 12 schools instead of that being shifted onto the backs of property taxpayers. So again, all of these budget line items provide dollar-for-dollar property tax relief statewide. And so as the legislature looks to reform the property tax system, it's going to be really important that they look really closely at these credits, because absent other reforms or other ways to bring down your property tax bill, not funding these credits is going to result in a property tax increase. So we got to proceed with caution and ensure that the legislature ultimately is providing relief in property taxes and not inadvertently making the property tax burden worse on Iowans.
Yeah, we have seen in the news that property taxes are going to be the top priority for the governor and legislature this session. What are some specific things Farm Bureau members want to see in terms of any property tax reform package that comes out of the legislature?
Well, it's true that property tax is going to be the top priority this upcoming legislative session. We've heard that from the governor's office, from the Senate, and from the House. For Farm Bureau, property taxes is a top priority every single legislative session. And we're really on the front lines when it comes to playing defense against proposals that would make the property tax burden even worse in Iowa. Farm Bureau has opposed and fought back against proposals that have been introduced that would expand levying authorities for local governments. It would shift school funding more towards property taxes, pushing back on ways in which local governments could do bonding paid for with property taxes without a vote of the people. And so these are all proposals that we've pushed back against, and we're going to continue to play defense on this issue and hopefully look for some opportunities to play offense this legislative session. You know, property taxes, I think we can safely say, are probably the most hated tax in the state of Iowa. It's the issue that legislators are hearing about the most at their forums and when they go door to door meeting with Iowans, and for good reason. Property taxes have doubled in the last 18 years. They're growing faster than the rate of inflation. They're growing faster than Iowans' incomes. They are growing at an unsustainable rate. And so when Farm Bureau is looking at property tax reform, overarching goals, ways in which to provide property tax relief would be to shift services away from property tax and find other funding sources for them, or find ways to slow the growth of local government budgets. When it comes to property taxes, you can really think of it like a big balloon, right? If we squeeze one part of the balloon, that's going to expand somewhere else. And that's always the case when you look at property tax reform. You may try to tweak the system to provide a break for seniors or provide a break for homeowners. But absent other reforms, that's just going to shift the burden to the other classes of property, including agriculture or commercial or industrial. Our goal would be to provide property tax relief for all classes of property, including agriculturally assessed property. We know that property tax is a cost of doing business for farmers. It's a cost of doing business that tends to go up even if profitability is down. So as we visit with legislators, we're going to ensure that any property tax reform package is beneficial to agriculture. We want to make sure it doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some good things in our property tax system that protects agriculturally assessed property. Now, we don't have to look very far to our west. In Nebraska, agricultural land is taxed and assessed at its market value. Iowa, fortunately, doesn't have that problem. Since the 1970s, agricultural land is assessed and taxed at its productivity value. Additionally, we have the rollback process that ensures that property taxes don't increase dramatically with the swings of the agricultural economy. So there are good things in our system we need to protect, and we also need to just make sure that the shift doesn't happen to make the property tax burden on agriculture higher, and that tax reform is beneficial for all classes of property, including ag.
That's very important work on those issues. Are there other tax reform issues that Farm Bureau will be looking at this upcoming session?
The tax situation in Iowa has shifted dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years, and there's been a lot of good things for agriculture that have been done. Just to name a few beneficial policies that have been enacted, we are fully coupled with the federal government on Section 179 small business expensing. We are fully coupled with the feds on bonus depreciation, which was increased in the One Big Beautiful Bill. We're fully coupled with the feds on the 20% qualified business income deduction as well. The legislature extended the capital gains exclusion on the sale of breeding livestock, which was a great win to help promote livestock growth in the state of Iowa. And the state's introduced and fully phased in now a repeal of Iowa's inheritance tax. And so a lot of good provisions that have been enacted over the years. We want to make sure we're protecting those. But Farm Bureau has identified 2 new tax policies that we'd like to pursue this upcoming legislative session. One regarding the student loan repayment for veterinarians who are serving in underserved areas of the state. In 2020, the legislature created a program that Farm Bureau supported that was a student loan repayment program for vets agreeing to serve in underserved areas and shortage areas. That program has been very popular. Unfortunately, the value of that student loan repayment is subject to Iowa income tax. We'd like to see that changed so that it is not charged income tax on those student loan repayments. And that would give us parity with similar programs that are incentivizing doctors to serve in rural areas as well. Additionally, the legislature enacted in 2022 a tax exemption on retirement income, and that included cash rental income for retired farmers. Unfortunately, when that bill was drafted, it only included that exemption for individual farmers, and it disqualified those farms that are organized as an S Corp, a trust, an estate, or a partnership. And so we want to make sure that similar people are treated similarly when it comes to their taxation. It's a matter of fairness and equity to ensure that all types of retired farmers, regardless of how they're organized for tax purposes, are receiving this tax benefit. Ultimately, we don't want a disincentive for those tools in the toolbox to help with estate planning. Oftentimes, those structures are designed to keep the farm in the family. And so we want to see a fix to that income tax provision in the state of Iowa.
Kevin, one of the things that you mentioned on the legislative agenda is a relatively new topic for many Iowans, the potential for the exploration and extraction of naturally occurring underground hydrogen. Tell me more about these developments.
Yeah, Tom, this is kind of a new and an exciting development in the state of Iowa. The potential that underneath our feet here in Iowa, there are pockets and pools of naturally occurring hydrogen gas. A study was put out by the United States Geological Survey that shows the potential in Iowa for this hydrogen to exist and to exist in quantities that would make extraction worthwhile. Iowa has never been an oil and a gas state. We've had exploration in the past, but they've never found anything. But this is a new development. And since Iowa has never really had an oil and gas industry, the laws on the books in this field are pretty bare bones. And so when we look at hydrogen exploration, we want to make sure that the state of Iowa sets the rules of the road very clearly and make sure that they're beneficial for agriculture and fair for landowners. This is a real opportunity for landowners. It's an opportunity to not only collect royalties from the extraction of this hydrogen, which landowners would own underneath their feet, but the possible use of this hydrogen are numerous, including turning that hydrogen into ammonia for fertilizer. And so the opportunities are great. We just want to make sure we have the legal framework that protects Iowa's farmers while still allowing for extraction to occur here in Iowa.
Now, Farm Bureau members recently set policy on this issue. Could you highlight some of the priorities that Farm Bureau is going to be pursuing in this upcoming legislative session?
That's right, Tom. And Farm Bureau has a policy development process that is second to none. getting the voices and opinions of thousands of farmers across the state who have studied and researched this issue. We've looked at what other states do that are oil and gas states and how their rules are organized. And so Farm Bureau has developed a variety of policies that we'd like to pursue and see enacted this upcoming legislative session. I'll highlight a few of them for you. In Iowa right now, if you're a surface owner, generally speaking, you own everything underneath your feet and you own those mineral rights. And so that's the case for a vast majority of Iowa landowners. There are some rare instances where those mineral rights were severed from the surface rights, whether it was for previous exploration or other reasons. But there's a situation where you might have an entity that has gone defunct owning the mineral rights underneath a surface owner's feet. And so we want to create a pathway for those mineral rights to remerge back with the surface rights. If there is hydrogen, we want to make sure that the surface owner has a clear understanding of who owns those mineral rights and they have an opportunity to own those mineral rights. But when it comes to the extraction and the mining and the drilling of this hydrogen, we want to make sure that surface owners are protected. We want to make sure that they're fairly compensated, that there are surface use agreements between the drilling company and the landowner. We want to make sure that land is restored properly, that farmers are compensated for any loss of value, for any loss of crop. And additionally, just making sure it's very clear in the law that the operator, the driller of the well is going to be responsible when that well is abandoned for capping that well and remediating the area. So those are all common sense reforms to make sure that we're protecting landowners in this process. The other set of policies that Farm Bureau members set policy on is regarding this concept of a pooling order. Now, this can get complicated really quickly, but imagine that there is a hydrogen pool that spans multiple properties underneath the state of Iowa. So you have multiple landowners involved, and the law needs to dictate when one landowner can go ahead and the drilling company can go ahead and try to extract that resource, because it's not possible for me to just extract the hydrogen under my footprint. I'm inevitably going to be taking the hydrogen from the adjacent landowners within that pool. So when a pool spans multiple properties, most states that have oil and gas laws, predominance of them, set a minimum threshold of the number of acres that have to be consenting before that extraction can happen. A lot of states will set that percentage anywhere between 40 and 80%. And this ensures that the landowners have some negotiating power with the drilling company. Right now in the state of Iowa, the code is set up where one landowner, regardless of how much of the pool they own, would be able to initiate a pooling order and begin extraction. So we want to make sure that landowners are being treated fairly, and setting that minimum threshold is going to help ensure that. Additionally, if a landowner is non-consenting, they don't want to participate in the pool, they need to make sure that they're going to receive their fair share of the royalties, because ultimately their resource, their property is going to be extracted. And so, like almost every other state, Farm Bureau members set a policy that there should be a minimum royalty for non-consenting owners. And then we also need to look at how much of those royalties can be used to pay back the drilling costs and ensuring there isn't a risk penalty on those non-consenting landowners. So this is a brand new topic for a lot of Iowans. Farm Bureau members are doing a great job visiting with legislators across the state to inform them of this potential, to inform them of the way in which the rules should be set up to ensure that landowners are treated fairly, while also encouraging the harvesting of this natural resource to the benefit of landowners and to the benefit of Iowa.
Kevin, one of the topics that Farm Bureau has covered extensively, including on numerous episodes of this podcast, is showcasing the great work that Iowa farmers are doing to advance water quality. Can you talk about the role that the Iowa legislature plays in all of this discussion?
We know that we have a great story to tell in agriculture about the progress that's being made on water quality, the rapid adoption of practices, Iowa leading the nation in so many practices, Cover crops, for example, going back just a few years where we had 10,000 acres of cover crops, now we're up to 3 million acres of cover crops. Widespread adoption of wetlands, buffer strip, bioreactors. These are all things that farmers are doing. But the role that the state plays in all of this is being a great partner with those farmers to help them get those practices on the ground, which ultimately benefit all Iowans and benefit everybody downstream. So some have a short memory, but the legislature passed, and the first bill that Governor Reynolds signed was Senate File 512, which established dedicated funding towards the Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy. That puts those practices on the ground that we know are scientifically proven to improve water quality in the state of Iowa. So the legislature has made that commitment. That funding will go out to at least 2039. And so we have that long-term dedicated funding. But also on top of that, every legislative session in the budget that we talked about earlier, there are multiple line items that fund additional water quality programs that create cost share to get practices on the ground with farmers taking the lead. Every year, the Farm Bureau, along with other groups, will go to the Capitol to advocate that this funding be continued, because it's critically important that the state continues to be that partner, and they've made that commitment to continue doing that funding on an annual basis. And so we want to make sure that the state continues to be a strong partner in funding water quality. And we know that this strategy is working because we're increasing the number of practices on the ground. We've seen other states take a different approach. We've seen states, particularly in the Northeast, take more of a regulatory approach when it comes to water quality, and we've seen they're not working. They're not seeing the results that they were expecting. Whereas in Iowa, we're funding water quality projects that we know work. They're on a voluntary basis, so the farmer knows best what works best for his land. And we've had administrators from the EPA in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration come to Iowa and point at us as a model in the Mississippi watershed of how to do conservation work. So the legislature is a great partner in this. We want to make sure that they continue to fund those important programs that help farmers get practices on the ground.
We've covered a lot already, Kevin, but are there other issues that Farm Bureau members will be focusing on during the 2026 session?
Yeah, I'm sure there will be other things that pop up. We won't know till we get there and bills start getting introduced by legislators. But know that Farm Bureau is uniquely positioned to follow the grassroots voices of Iowa farmers across the state. I mentioned that grassroots process that gets undertaken every single year. That establishes the policy book that we use at the Capitol to determine which bills that we register on, determines what we're advancing for. So every year we look for opportunities to continue to advance Farm Bureau's policies, all dictated by the grassroots efforts, and we'll continue to do that this upcoming legislative session.
Finally, why is it important for Farm Bureau members to engage with their legislators during the session and throughout the year, and how can they make their voice heard?
This is just critically important. Legislators need to hear from real people. They need to hear from their voters back home. They need to hear from real farmers, how these policies will impact real farmers, their families, their communities, how it'll impact their property tax bill, how it'll impact their ability to keep the farm in the family. Those real-world stories really move the needle, help convince legislators to support or oppose a bill that's introduced at the Capitol. I'll tell you, Farm Bureau does it better than anyone else. Having a unified voice at the Capitol, meeting with legislators, building relationships with them. There are other groups in the state of Iowa that come up to the Capitol that advocate for things that are not in farmers' best interest. So absent the farmer voice, those are the voices that legislators are going to hear. So it's critically important that farmers across the state continue to be engaged. Farm Bureau helps give you the tools to be able to do that. And I know that Farm Bureau members across the state will, again, as they do every year, do a great job advocating for their interests this upcoming legislative session.
Thanks, Kevin. As usual, there's plenty to tackle down at the State House. Of course, it's our job to stay on top of those issues and speak up for Iowa's farmers. Kevin and the entire Iowa Farm Bureau government relations team do an outstanding job of that. No one does it better. But what really moves the needle for state lawmakers is all of you. When County Farm Bureau members engage their state lawmakers on the issues that matter to farmers and agriculture, those lawmakers listen. If you haven't already, now is a good time to get involved in your County Farm Bureau and make sure that your farm story is heard in 2026. Another good reason to engage your County Farm Bureau is all of the local opportunities to gain some knowledge and perspective that will benefit your farm. One good example is Iowa Farm Bureau's upcoming Ag Market Outlook meeting series, which features a handful of half-day meetings across the state this February. For more on that, Tom Block spoke with Iowa Farm Bureau's Farmer Education Program Manager, Zach Brummer.
Zach, again this year, Farm Bureau will be hosting a series of Ag Market Outlook meetings around the state. What's happening right now in the farm economy that made Iowa Farm Bureau feel like these Market Outlook meetings were necessary heading into 2026?
You know, we just like to get out in front of our members and in front of the rural community, and being based here in Des Moines, I really like to just take it on the road and go out and shake some hands and talk to people about what they're facing and give them some insights and discuss maybe some risk management strategies that they can think about as they go forward. And so as we look out on the landscape this year, we've got another year of compressed margins and high input costs and commodity price volatility pretty much everywhere you look. So getting out in front of people, and we're not really trying to predict where markets are headed, but just provide them with some tools that they can use, as we roll the calendar to 2026 and look forward to getting into the fields for planting this spring, some tools they can use to plan for the year ahead.
So what does the agenda look like at these meetings? I know they follow the same format with different presenters as you go to different sections of the state, but give us a brief idea of the agenda and when and where these meetings will be held.
Yeah, we're having 6 meetings across the state, kind of east and west this year. We're going to be meeting in O'Brien County, Sac County, Harrison, Winneshiek, Jones, as well as Jefferson County. And those are taking place between February 16th and February 25th. For the exact details there, you can hop on iowafarmbureau.com as well as register there. The agenda is, as I was putting it together, I kind of wanted to cover multiple bases. So each meeting is going to have a industry representative from a local bank come have a discussion about what they're seeing in their local community in terms of ag finances and financing, and what they're seeing from producer behavior and what advice they're giving their clients on what to expect and how they can behave in 2026. Then Christopher Pudens, who's our economist, as well as myself, are going to talk about commodity markets. He'll focus more on the livestock sector, and I'll stick with the grains and oilseeds. And then we also have some folks from Farm Bureau Financial Services who are going to be joining us. They're going to talk about some new insights on crop insurance for 2026, as well as some risk management practices you can employ, such as livestock risk protection, things like that. We're dealing with some record high commodity prices when it comes to cattle, and protecting that downside risk should be a priority as we move forward. And so if that's a tool you haven't used, you'll gain some insights there as well.
Let's just touch on some of the issues and topics that are happening right now that are kind of top of mind for farmers out there. What are the biggest sources of uncertainty that farmers should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest one everyone's pretty aware of in terms of the soybean complex, the balance sheet, and what we're seeing from our trade partners, specifically China, who, represents roughly 50% of the export demand for U.S. soybeans year after year. That's been a pretty significant issue, as we're aware of, as we head into 2026. We've seen the announcements that they're going to start buying. They have, in fact, started putting those purchases of U.S. soybeans on. But when you go look at the economics of that, they're paying a premium for U.S. soybeans compared to what they can source soybeans out of Brazil for. We still have a 10% tariff in place that further widens that spread between those two origins. And Brazil has a massive, currently projected to be another record crop, pretty much pointed right at us. So as we look forward, seeing what China actually does. It's one thing to put those purchases on. It's another thing to actually take delivery of those soybeans. And so again, with some of those economics that I mentioned, it's just going to be a challenge. So far, the purchases have all come from state-owned entities. It's not any private entities. And so it's really China honoring that handshake agreement that was made. Whether or not that continued as we move forward, that's kind of the big question mark there. I could go into detail on the other commodities, but that's really the one that, at least for me, I think is going to have the biggest effect on P&Ls at the farm gate as we move forward, depending on which way that goes.
And another major concern going into the crop years as people are buying their inputs are interest rates and financing costs. What should farmers be thinking about differently when it comes to borrowing, cash flow, and their lender conversations here going into the 2026 planting season?
I think a lot of producers are already doing that in terms of thinking differently. You're seeing a lot of behaviors going away from trying to capture the highest price, more towards focusing on break evens. Where do I need to be? How leveraged am I? And really, I hate to use the term treading water, but keeping your head above water. And many aren't really in expansion mode right now. It's more of a survival mode, you might call it. And so how that affects equipment availability, equipment sales, equipment purchases, the need for financing when it comes to some of those things. We saw ISU come out with their land survey, and we saw pretty much a year of stagnation in terms of what land prices are doing. And so I think you're going to continue to see more of that behavior as we move into 2026 as folks really focus more on risk management rather than taking aggressive positions or trying to capture the highest prices in the market.
You mentioned that there'll be some Farm Bureau financial crop insurance agents at these meetings. Why is crop insurance and the livestock risk protection products, why are those such a critical part of the conversation this year?
Price protection matters all the time, but it's especially important when you're dealing with thin margins. And so, insurance is no longer just downside protection. It's even more so of a planning tool as we come into 2026. LRP's, really the same situation. It's a pretty significant strategy that you can employ to protect from downside risk. And so I think the corn and cattle markets are kind of polar opposites, perhaps, when you look at them. And so on one end, you're kind of standing on top of the quote unquote cliff, you could say, with cattle markets being at near all-time highs. Protecting from that downside risk is critical. And then, on the corn side or soybean side, even, we've seen soybeans sell off after rallying a bit in Q4. You're really kind of sitting there going, okay, where do I need to set my floor? Where can I set my floor? That type of mentality. And so, again, just really important this year in particular, just to really have a sound risk management strategy in place. And those are the tools that we can employ to do that.
And there are a lot of risk management tools out there through the private market, through crop insurance. And we know there were some changes that may make some of those more attractive, and that'll be covered at these meetings. But what's one risk management or marketing tool that's out there that farmers maybe know about, but they might be underutilizing or maybe could be put to place this year?
Having a marketing plan, putting a marketing plan in place, I think a lot of folks are going to be, that's going to be part of the discussion with their lender more so than ever, perhaps. Really, again, just to protect from that downside risk and, to secure financing where it's needed, they're going to have a plan in place. And so really spending some time thinking through that and then executing it when the time comes is going to be critical this year. And so there's a lot more that we'll cover at the meetings, but that's one where I think a lot of years we intend to do it. We might even put a plan together at the beginning of the year, and then as we get busy throughout the year, as we always do, there's things that fall through the cracks, and those plans are typically one of them. This will be an important year to make sure that we're keeping on top of them.
Now, livestock markets have helped offset pressure in the grain sector here during the past year. Do you expect that to continue, or are margins tightening there too?
We saw the cattle markets really sell off hard after, some of the comments around some Argentinian beef that really weren't based in, the fundamentals of the trade in terms of the amount of reaction we saw from the markets. And we've since seen the markets start coming back more gradually. specifically talking about feeder cattle and live cattle here. But I expect, we're not seeing anything point to a fundamental shift in terms of the cattle markets. And so we should expect strong returns to continue in the cattle market. That's not to say that we shouldn't protect against, again, that volatility. You don't have to have a very long memory to know what I'm talking about there. But the fundamentals are there to keep a nice floor under the cattle market and keep prices strong as we move forward. In corn and soybeans, it's a little bit more of a challenge, a really unique situation there as well in terms of almost polar opposites in terms of the balance sheet potential here on soybeans. From a global perspective, you've got just shy of record stocks. And that, again, is creating issues when it comes to Chinese soybean demand. There's plenty of soybeans in the world, and that creates an issue there. When you look at corn, it's kind of the opposite. Stocks are lower than we've seen, and we've got, specifically in the United States, very strong export demand for our corn. Mexico, again, is a significant purchaser of U.S. corn as we enter 2026. And so contrast that to our lack of export sales in soybeans. And so you've got a unique dynamic shaping up there. It's going to be interesting to see what acreage and things like that do as we move forward here. But I think it's going to be challenging, again, because that soybean market is just the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room. And we got to make sure that we get that dealt with before we can really get too excited about anything else.
One of the benefits, Zach, of taking these meetings on the road to the farmers are you have this sort of regionality about it. So how do the discussions and questions from the farmers help shape the conversations that happen at each of these locations?
It's, interesting. You get, in certain areas, you get more cattle folks or hog folks, and in other areas, you're strictly talking to row crop farmers. And so that creates some diversity, and the last meeting has always got a lot more residual input and conversation, again, because you've had those one-on-one conversations with those different groups. And so you gain insights as you go along. And so it's just a really good structure and a really fun process to kind of go through and have those meetings and have those different conversations. And the goal is for the attendees to learn something, but inevitably all the presenters learn a lot as well, which is a positive of the meetings as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've done these before. You had some of these meetings last year. What kind of feedback did you get from the past attendees about what they took away and were able to apply to their operations?
It's a time of year when a lot of people, a lot of industry groups are having outlook type meetings. And so a lot of the feedback we've gotten is that they appreciate that there's a little more sustenance to the meetings than just, market predictions, quote unquote. I mentioned this earlier, but we're not really having these meetings to say, here's where we think the price is going and here's what you should do. It's more of here's what we see in the current market environment. Here are some potential outcomes, and here's, how you can protect yourself given the potential for those different outcomes. On top of that, we really focus on just having conversations, encouraging questions. And that kind of happens organically. Don't feel like if you come to one of the meetings, you're going to be asked to speak. But at every one of the meetings we've held over the years, we generally see that kind of happen over the course of the meeting. People get curious or something said that they have questions about, and that leads to discussion. So it's a really good networking opportunity on top of everything else. There's a hot meal that's catered at each meeting, a coffee bar. And so it's just a pretty nice, warm place in February to have a break and have a discussion and leave with some nuggets of information that you might not have had before you showed up.
So as these meetings approach us here in the next few weeks, how can people get signed up to attend?
Members can go to iowafarmbureau.com and sign up there. It's on the homepage under Outlook Meetings. You just click it and then sign up. You'll be in. If you're not a member, you can call your local county farm bureau. They can help you get signed up, and we'd love to see you.
Thanks, Zach. That's just a taste of what you can expect to learn when you show up at an Ag Market Outlook meeting near you in February. You can read more about those meetings and get registered at iowafarmbureau.com or by clicking the link we've provided down in the notes for this podcast episode. And while you're out on the website, I'd like to call out 2 other events you should consider signing up for this winter. The first one is Iowa Farm Bureau's Take Root Farm Secession Workshops. Just like the Ag Market Outlook series, these Take Root workshops are a series that travels across the state, helping farmers plan to keep the farm in the family for generations to come. If you haven't attended Take Root before, you need to check it out and find the workshop closest to you this year. The second event I'll bring to your attention is Iowa Farm Bureau's Acres of Opportunity Conference. We all know that Iowa agriculture has become a lot more diverse over the past several years. You've got direct-to-consumer farms, specialty meat markets, agritourism, and farmers growing everything from flowers to berries. If that kind of diversification is something you're considering for your own farm, you really need to attend the Acres of Opportunity Conference. It's a popular day-long event that has attracted hundreds of folks from across the state. This year, the Acres of Opportunity Conference is in Spencer on Saturday, February 21st. You can see the full agenda and get signed up at iowafarmbureau.com or by clicking our link down in the podcast notes. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you picked up some helpful information and that you'll join us for our next episode on February 2nd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.